My son sat me down at the kitchen table and slid a debit card across to me. "There's $200 a week on this," he said. "That should cover everything you need." I stared at the card. I had lived in that house for 36 years. I raised him in that house, and now he was giving me an allowance. What he didn't know was that 2 days earlier, I had received a call from my late sister's attorney in London. She had passed away and left me her entire estate, $75 million. But I didn't say a word. I just took the card and smiled. Subscribe and tell me, what time is it where you are right now? The card felt cold against my fingertips. It was plastic, cheap. It smelled like the new PIN numbers they send you in the mail. My son David stood there with his arms crossed. He was wearing a grey suit that cost more than my first car. He looked at me like I was a tenant who had overstayed her welcome. I slipped the card into my pocket. I told him thank you. My voice did not shake. David nodded once and walked out of the kitchen. I heard his footsteps on the hardwood floor, heavy, impatient. I waited until the front door clicked shut. Then I stood up and walked to the window. I watched him get into his silver SUV. He did not look back at the house. The sun was setting over the suburb of Columbus. The light hit the siding of the house. It was a nice house. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a 2-car garage. It was not my house. I was a guest here, or so they wanted me to believe. I turned away from the window. The kitchen was clean. Too clean. There were no crumbs on the counter. There were no dishes in the sink. Sarah had cleaned before David gave me the card. She wanted the stage set. She wanted me to feel small. I walked to the refrigerator. I opened it. There was a container with my name on it, Joan, written in black marker. Inside was cold chicken and some lettuce. No dressing, no side dish. Just protein and greens. I took it out. I sat at the table where David had sat minutes before. I ate slowly. I thought about the phone call from London. The attorney's name was Mr. Henderson. He had a British accent. He spoke slowly. He said the paperwork was complete. He said the funds were secure. He said no one else could access them, not even a power of attorney. I finished the chicken. I wrapped the container back up. I put it in the fridge. I walked to the living room. I sat in the armchair. It was facing the television. David usually sat there. I was not supposed to sit there, but I did. I leaned back. I closed my eyes. I thought about the number again. $75 million. It was too big to understand. It was just zeros in a bank account. But it was freedom. It was power. It was the ability to say no. I opened my eyes. The room was dark. The clock on the wall ticked. It was a loud tick. Every second sounded like a hammer. I waited for David to come back. I waited for Sarah to come home. I needed to see their faces. I needed to see if they knew. I did not think they knew. If they knew, they would not have given me the card. They would have been nicer. They would have pretended to love me. This was about control. They wanted to keep me on a leash. They wanted to make sure I depended on them. They wanted to make sure I could not leave. But they did not know I had already bought the rope. They did not know I could cut it whenever I wanted. I stood up. I walked to the hallway. I looked at the photos on the wall. There were pictures of David as a boy. There were pictures of his wedding. There were pictures of his children. There were no pictures of me. Not one. I had been erased. I walked back to the kitchen. I washed the plate. I dried it. I put it away. I went to my room. It was the guest room on the first floor. It was small. It had a window that looked out at the driveway. I locked the door. I sat on the bed. I took the card out of my pocket. I looked at it under the lamp. It was a standard bank card. No logo, no name. Just a number. I put it in the drawer. I lay down. I stared at the ceiling. I thought about Robert. He would have known what to do. He would have laughed. He would have told me to take the card and buy something nice. But Robert was gone. I was alone. Except I was not alone. I had the money. I had the secret. I had the truth. I closed my eyes. I slept. I dreamed of London. I dreamed of a big house. I dreamed of walking away. That small detail didn't seem important at the time. It would later change everything. I had moved in with David 6 months earlier. My husband, Robert, had died in January. A stroke. Quick, merciful. Or so I thought. The house we shared for 40 years felt too big without him. The silence was loud. David insisted I come live with him and his wife, Sarah. He said it was for safety. He said he worried about me falling. He said the stairs were too much. I believed him. I packed my clothes. I packed Robert's photos. I left the house in Ohio to be rented out. David said he would handle the paperwork. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my only child. We lived in a modest brick house on a quiet street outside Cleveland. It wasn't large, and it certainly wasn't luxurious, but every corner of it carried a memory. The oak tree in the backyard that Robert planted the year David was born. The faded pencil marks on the kitchen wall where we measured David's height every birthday. The creaky wooden stairs Robert always promised he'd fix, but never quite got around to. Robert used to say a home wasn't the wall, it was the years inside them. Robert was the careful one in our marriage. An engineer by profession, he believed in plans, backup plans, and then one more plan in case the first two failed. While I spent 35 years teaching second graders how to read and tie their shoes, Robert spent those same decades designing bridges and worrying about things collapsing. But in our home, nothing ever felt like it would collapse. David grew up loved, supported, and encouraged. When he struggled with math in middle school, Robert sat at the kitchen table night after night helping him. When David wanted to attend Ohio State for business school, we quietly took money from our savings to help cover what scholarships didn't. We never considered it a sacrifice. That's what parents do. David was ambitious, though not always careful. In his late 20s, he tried to start a small logistics company with a friend. It failed within 2 years, leaving him with debt and embarrassment. Robert and I helped him through that too, though we never told anyone outside the family. Robert said something to me during that time that I didn't think much about then. Helping someone stand up is good, he told me one evening while we washed dishes. But if you carry them too long, they may forget how to walk. I thought he was just being philosophical. David eventually recovered, found steady work, and married Sarah when he was 32. Sarah was smart, organized, and very direct. She worked in healthcare administration and had a way of speaking that made people listen carefully. When David told us he planned to marry her, Robert simply nodded. If she keeps him focused, Robert said later, that might be exactly what he needs. For several years, everything seemed stable. David and Sarah moved to Columbus for work and bought a house in a growing suburb. Robert and I visited a few times a year, usually during holidays. They had 2 children, Emily first, then Lucas. And becoming grandparents felt like discovering a new room in our hearts we didn't know existed. Life moved forward the way life does, quietly, steadily, until the night Robert died. It was a Tuesday in early January. I remember the weather because Robert had complained the entire afternoon about the cold wind outside. We were watching television when he suddenly pressed his hand to his chest and leaned forward. At first, I thought it was heartburn. By the time the ambulance arrived, the paramedics were already shaking their heads. The doctor at the hospital used gentle words, but the meaning was clear. Massive stroke. Nothing they could do. After 40 years of marriage, the silence in that house felt unbearable. Grief is a strange companion. It changes the weight of every object around you. Robert's chair felt too empty. His coffee mug felt like evidence of something stolen. For the first 3 months after his death, I barely left the house. David called often during that time. At first, his voice sounded genuinely worried. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone all the time," he told me one evening. "I'm all right," I insisted, though that wasn't entirely true. But David kept calling, kept checking in. Sarah joined the calls sometimes too. Then one Sunday afternoon, David drove up from Columbus and sat with me at the kitchen table, where Robert and I had eaten thousands of meals. "Mom," he said gently, "have you thought about moving closer to us?" I shook my head at first. "This is my home," I said. David nodded slowly. "I know, but it's also a lot to manage alone. The house, the yard, the bills. It's too much for one person your age." I remember the way he said, "your age." Not cruelly, just practically. Sarah had already been researching options, he explained. Their house had a spare bedroom. The kids would love having their grandmother nearby, and I wouldn't have to worry about the winter snow. He made it sound like a rescue mission. He made it sound like love. I looked around the kitchen. I saw the dust on the counters. I saw the pile of mail on the table. I saw the empty chair where Robert used to sit. I felt tired. I felt lonely. I said yes. I said I would try it. David smiled. He hugged me. He said everything would be okay. He said he would take care of everything. I believed him. I packed my bags. I locked the front door. I left the key under the mat. I got in the car. I drove to Columbus. I thought I was going to live with my son. I thought I was going to be safe. I did not know I was driving into a trap. Something about the way he said those words made my stomach tighten. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. Sarah made me tea in the mornings. David asked about my day when he came home from work. He was a financial advisor. He dealt with numbers all day. He knew the value of $1. Or so I thought. The change started slowly. A comment here, a sigh there. Sarah stopped asking me to join them for dinner. She said they were trying to eat healthier, smaller portions. I started eating in my room. Then David started asking about my mail. He said he could organize it for me. He said bills were confusing for older people. I handed him the envelopes. I didn't think much of it. I thought he was helping. I thought he was protecting me from scams. There are so many scams targeting seniors. He said it all the time. He said he read about them in the news. He said he wanted to keep me safe. I gave him my bank statements. I gave him my pension notices. I gave him everything. I didn't ask for them back. I didn't think I needed to. I was living in his house. I was eating his food. I was using his electricity. I felt like a burden. I tried to make myself useful. I folded the laundry. I watered the plants. I watched the children when Sarah was busy. But it never seemed like enough. Sarah would check the dust on the shelves. She would look in the refrigerator. She would sigh if I left a light on. It was little things, but they added up. They made me feel like a child. They made me feel like I was losing my mind. One evening, David came home early. He sat me down in the living room. He said we needed to talk about finances. He said my pension was not enough to cover my share of the household expenses. He said utilities were going up. He said food costs were rising. He said he did not want to worry me, but I needed to contribute. I asked him how. He said he could withdraw money from my savings. He said he could manage it for me. He said it would be easier. I said I could write the checks. He said it was too much trouble. He said I might make a mistake. He said he didn't want me to stress. I looked at him. I saw the look in his eyes. It was not concern. It was calculation. He was testing me. He was seeing how much I would give. I said okay. I said he could withdraw what he needed. He smiled. He said, "Thank you, Mum." He said I was making the right choice. He stood up. He patted my shoulder. He walked away. I sat there. I felt small. I felt weak. I felt like I was disappearing. I went to my room. I looked in the mirror. I saw an old woman. Grey hair, wrinkles, tired eyes. I wondered when I became this person. I wondered when I stopped being Joan. I started being Mum. I started being Grandma. I started being a cost. I lay on the bed. I listened to the house. I heard Sarah laughing in the kitchen. I heard David on the phone. I heard the children playing. They were happy. I was alone. I closed my eyes. I thought about Robert. I thought about his voice. I thought about his hands. I missed him. I missed the way he looked at me. He never made me feel like a burden. He never made me feel like a cost. He made me feel like a partner. I missed that. I missed us. I fell asleep. I dreamed of the house in Cleveland. I dreamed of the oak tree. I dreamed of the creaky stairs. I dreamed of Robert waiting for me on the porch. I woke up. The room was dark. The house was quiet. I sat up. I felt a chill. I wrapped the blanket around me. I walked to the door. I opened it. I walked down the hallway. I went to the kitchen. I needed water. I turned on the light. I saw a piece of paper on the floor. It was near the trash can. It had fallen out. I picked it up. It was a bank statement. It was mine. It was from my account in Ohio. It was opened. The seal was broken. I looked at the balance. It was lower than I remembered. Much lower. I did the math in my head. Robert and I had saved carefully. We had pensions. We had investments. The number on the paper didn't match the number in my head. I folded the letter. I put it in my pocket. I drank the water. I went back to my room. I locked the door. I sat on the bed. I looked at the paper. I read it again. I read the transactions. There were withdrawals, large ones. They were made by David. They were labelled as household expenses, but they were too big. They were too frequent. I felt the blood drain from my face. I heard a car pull into the driveway. I moved the paper. I hid it under my pillow. I turned off the light. I lay down. I waited. I heard the front door open. I heard footsteps. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath. The footsteps moved away. I exhaled. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep. I waited for the sun. 3 weeks and 2 days after the funeral, the truth began to surface. I waited until David left for work. He left early every morning. He said he had meetings. He said he had clients. He said he needed to provide for the family. I waited until Sarah took the children to school. She dropped them off at 8. She came back at 9. I had 1 hour. I went to the kitchen. I opened the drawer where David kept the spare keys. I found the key to his office. It was on a blue ring. I took it. I went to the hallway. I walked to the door at the end. It was usually locked. Today, it was ajar. I stepped inside. The room smelt like leather and cologne. His computer was on, sleep mode. I moved the mouse. The screen lit up. There was a folder open. It was labelled Mum. I clicked it. There were scans of my documents, my social security card, my pension forms, my deed to the Ohio house, and there was a spreadsheet. It listed assets, liabilities, and a column labelled Transfer Date. The dates were all in the future, next month, 2 months from now. I felt the blood drain from my face. I heard a car pull into the driveway. I moved the mouse to close the window. My hand was shaking. I left the room just as the front door opened. Sarah walked in carrying groceries. She looked at me standing in the hallway. Her eyes narrowed. Just for a second. Then she smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. She asked me if I needed help with anything. I said no. I said I was just looking for a glass of water. She nodded and walked past me. I went to the kitchen. I poured the water. I drank it slowly. I needed to think. I needed to know what was in that spreadsheet. But I couldn't go back into the office. Not yet. I realized something I hadn't known I was ready to understand. They were not taking care of me. They were preparing to take everything. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I could hear David snoring in the master bedroom upstairs. I lay in the guest room on the first floor. I thought about Robert. He used to say, "Paperwork matters." He said it every time we signed a loan or bought insurance. "Paperwork matters, Joan." I hadn't listened enough. I had let David handle the transition. I had let him be the power of attorney. I thought it was a formality. I thought it was love. I rolled over and looked at the clock. It was 3 in the morning. I picked up my phone. I had a private number saved. An old friend. Margaret. She lived in London. She was my sister's best friend. I pressed call. It rang twice. Margaret answered. Her voice was sleepy but clear. I told her I had gotten the call from the attorney. I told her about the money. $75 million. I told her I hadn't told David. Margaret went silent. Then she spoke. She said I needed to be careful. She said money changes people. She said especially people who think they are owed something. I told her about the card, the $200. Margaret laughed. It was a dry sound. She said I should play along. She said I needed time. She said the attorney in London would send a representative, but it would take a week. I could wait a week. I said I could wait. I hung up. I lay back down. I stared at the ceiling. For the first time since Robert died, I felt something other than grief. Clarity. The next morning at breakfast, David was reading the news on his tablet. Sarah was scrolling through her phone. I sat at the end of the table. I had my coffee. David looked up. He asked me if I had any plans for the day. I said I thought I might go for a walk. He nodded. He said the neighborhood was safe. Then he put the tablet down. He looked at me. He said he wanted to talk about the Ohio house. He said the market was hot. He said it might be a good time to sell. I put my cup down. I asked him why we would sell. He said it was too much maintenance. He said I couldn't manage it from here. He said he could handle the sale. He said he would put the money in a trust for my care. Something about the way he said trust made my chest tighten. I told him I needed to think about it. I said it was Robert's house. David sighed. He said he was just trying to help. He said I was being stubborn. Sarah looked up from her phone. She said quietly that stress wasn't good for my blood pressure. They exchanged a glance. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. It was a look of impatience, like I was a child refusing to eat vegetables. I stood up. I said I needed some air. I walked out the front door. I walked down the street. The air was cool. It was early autumn. The leaves were turning yellow. I walked for an hour. I thought about the spreadsheet. I thought about the letter in the trash. I thought about the $75 million waiting in London. When I came back, the house was empty. They had left for work. I went to the kitchen. I opened the drawer where David kept the spare keys. I found the key to his office. I went inside. I locked the door. I sat at his computer. I needed to see more. I opened the folder again. I clicked on the spreadsheet. I scrolled down. There was a note at the bottom. It said, "Probate completion estimated date." It was set for next month. There was another file. It was a draft of a letter. It was addressed to a nursing home. It was about me. It said I was showing signs of dementia. It said I was confused about finances. It said I was a risk to myself. I felt sick. I stood up. I needed to sit down. I leaned against the desk. Then I heard Sarah whisper something that made my blood run cold. She was on the phone in the hallway. I hadn't heard her come home. She must have forgotten something. Her voice drifted through the door. She was talking to her sister. She said once the papers are signed, she won't have a choice. She said David is handling the doctor. She said the facility is already paid for. She said the house money will cover the rest. She said 75 million would be better, but we take what we can get. I froze. They knew. They knew about the inheritance. Or they suspected. They thought it was less. They thought they could grab what they could before the rest disappeared. I waited until her footsteps faded. Then I unlocked the door. I slipped out. I went back to my room. I closed the door. I sat on the bed. I took the debit card out of my pocket. I looked at it. I realized something I hadn't known I was ready to understand. This was not about care. This was about consumption. I called Margaret again later that night. I waited until the house was completely silent. I waited until the clock on the wall struck 2 in the morning. I went into the bathroom and closed the door. I turned on the faucet. I let the water run so it would mask the sound of my voice. I dialed the number carefully. I used my private phone, the one David did not know about, the one I kept in my pillowcase. Margaret answered on the first ring. She said she was waiting for my call. I told her what I heard. I told her about the nursing home letter. I told her they knew about the money. Or they suspected. Margaret said the timeline had changed. She said the attorney could move faster. She said someone would come to me tomorrow. She said I needed to keep them calm. She said, do not sign anything. She said, do not argue. She said, just wait. I agreed. I hung up. I turned off the faucet. I looked in the mirror. I saw an old woman. Grey hair, wrinkles, tired eyes. But behind the eyes, there was steel. Robert used to say paperwork matters. I was going to make sure the paperwork was perfect. I went back to the kitchen. I made dinner. I set the table. I acted normal. When David came home, he smiled. He asked how my walk was. I said it was nice. He said good. He said he loved me. I believed him once. Not anymore. The next morning was Tuesday. David left for work early. Sarah stayed home. She said she had a meeting from home. She sat at the dining table with her laptop. I sat in the living room. I read a book. I did not read the pages. I watched her. At 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Sarah jumped. She looked at me. She said she wasn't expecting anyone. I said neither was I. I walked to the door. I opened it. A man stood there. He was wearing a dark suit. He held a briefcase. He looked serious. He said he was from the London firm. He said he had documents for Joan Miller. That was my maiden name. Sarah stood up. She walked into the hallway. She asked who he was. The man looked at her. He said he was an attorney. He said he needed to speak with Mrs. Miller privately. Sarah laughed. It was a nervous sound. She said I was her mother-in-law. She said she handled my affairs. She said I was not well. The man looked at me. He asked if that was true. I looked at Sarah. I looked at the man. I said no. I said I was perfectly well. I said I would speak with him. I invited him into the living room. I closed the door. Sarah stood in the hallway. I could see her shadow through the glass. She was pacing. The man sat on the sofa. He opened his briefcase. He took out a folder. He said the estate of Elizabeth Miller was settled. He said the funds were ready. He said $75 million. He said it was wired to a new account. He handed me a document. It was the account number. It was in my name. Only my name. He said no one else had access. He said not even a power of attorney. He said the will was very specific. It said the money was for me alone. It said if anyone tried to coerce me, the money would go to charity. I looked at the paper. I signed where he asked. He stood up. He shook my hand. He said congratulations. He said he would be in touch. He walked out. Sarah was waiting in the hall. She asked what that was about. I said just an old friend. I said he dropped something off. She looked at the man walking to his car. She looked at me. Her eyes were hard. She said, David needs to see those papers. I said, maybe later. I walked to my room. I locked the door. Because what happened next changed everything I believed about family. David came home early. He was angry. Sarah must have called him. He walked into the living room. I was sitting there. He didn't say hello. He asked me who the man was. I said an attorney. He asked what he wanted. I said he delivered a message. David sat down. He leaned forward. He said, Mom, you need to be careful. He said there are scams. He said people target widows. I said, I know what a scam looks like. David stood up. He shouted. He said, you are living in my house. He said you eat my food. He said you have no money. He said you are dependent on us. He said, sign the papers for the Ohio house. He said, sign the power of attorney update. He said, do it now. I looked at him. I saw the boy who cried when he scraped his knee. He was gone. This was a stranger. I stood up. I said, no. David stepped closer. He said, you don't have a choice. He said, we can put you in a home. He said, we have the doctor's note. He said, you are confused. He said, you signed it last week. I smiled. I asked him when. He said, last Tuesday. I said I was at the grocery store last Tuesday. I said I have the receipt. I said I have the camera footage from the store. David paused. He looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at the floor. I said I also have the letter you wrote about the nursing home. I said I have the spreadsheet. I said I have the opened bank statement. The room felt unusually quiet. David's face went pale. He said you went through my things. I said you left the door open. I said you thought I was too old to understand. I said you thought I was too weak to fight. I said you were wrong. David laughed. It was a bitter sound. He said, what are you going to do? He said you have nowhere to go. He said you have no money. He said that card is all you have. I reached into my pocket. I took out the card. I held it up. I said, you are right. This is all I have from you. I dropped it on the table. It made a small click. I said, I don't need it. David asked what I meant. I said, I have my own money. David said, you have pension. He said, it is not enough. I said, I have $75 million. David stopped breathing. For a moment, the room felt like it had no air. He looked at Sarah. She looked at me. Her mouth was open. David said, that is not possible. I said, my sister left it to me. I said, it is in London. I said, it is in my name. I said, no one else can touch it. I said, if you try, it goes to charity. David sat down. He put his head in his hands. He said, why didn't you tell us? I said, because I wanted to see what you would do. I said, now I know. I said, you were waiting for me to die. I said you were planning to sell my house. I said you were planning to put me in a home. I said you were planning to steal my life. And suddenly, Robert's warning echoed in my mind. Paperwork matters. David looked up. His eyes were wet. He said we were just worried. He said we wanted to secure your future. I said you wanted to secure your inheritance. I said there is a difference. I stood up. I said I am leaving. David said, where will you go? I said, I have options. I said I have friends. I said I have money. I said I have dignity. I walked to my room. I packed my bag. I had already called a car. It was waiting outside. I walked out of the room. David did not stop me. Sarah did not speak. I walked to the front door. I opened it. The air was cool. I stepped onto the porch. I turned around. David was standing in the hallway. He looked small. He looked lost. I said, do not contact me. I said my attorney will handle the rest. I said, goodbye, David. I got into the car. The driver asked where to. I said, the hotel. I had booked a suite. It was large. It was quiet. It was mine. I sat on the bed. I looked out the window. I could see the house. I could see David standing in the window. He was watching me leave. I felt a pain in my chest. It was grief. But it was not for Robert. It was for the son I thought I had. I picked up the phone. I called Margaret. I told her it was done. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I will be." She said, "What about the house in Ohio?" I said, "I will sell it." I said, "I will give the money to a scholarship." I said, "In Robert's name." She said, "That sounds like him." I said, "Yes, it does." 3 weeks and 2 days after I left David's house, I bought a new home. It was a 3-bedroom brick house on Maple Street outside Cleveland. It was near the park. It was near the library. It was near the school where I used to teach. I filled it with new furniture. I filled it with new photos. I did not throw away the old ones. I kept Robert's chair. I kept his mug. I kept his memory. I hired a helper. Her name was Maria. She was kind. She asked before she touched anything. She asked how I wanted my tea. She listened. I paid her well. I paid her double what David would have paid. She smiled. She said thank you. I said no, thank you. David tried to call. I did not answer. He sent letters. I returned them unopened. His attorney called my attorney. They spoke. My attorney said the power of attorney was revoked. My attorney said the Ohio house was sold. My attorney said the funds were donated. David stopped calling. I heard from a neighbor that he and Sarah were fighting. I heard they were in debt. I heard they had to move to a smaller apartment. I did not feel happy about it. I did not feel sad. I felt nothing. It was their choice. They chose money over love. They chose control over care. They chose greed over family. I started volunteering at the library. I helped children read. I saw a boy once. He looked like David. He struggled with a book. I sat with him. I helped him sound out the words. He smiled when he finished. He said thank you. I said, "You did the work." I said, "You are smart." I said, "You can do anything." He ran back to his mother. I watched him go. I realized I still had love to give, just not to everyone. Not to people who saw me as a burden. Not to people who saw me as a wallet. I gave it to those who needed it. I gave it to those who asked kindly. 1 year later, I got a letter. It was from David. It was handwritten. The paper was cheap. The handwriting was shaky. He said he was sorry. He said he missed me. He said he understood now. He said he hoped I was well. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for help. He just said, sorry. I read the letter. I held it for a long time. I thought about burning it. I thought about keeping it. I put it in a drawer. I closed the drawer. I did not write back. Not yet. Maybe someday. When the pain was less. When the memory was softer. For now, I was content. I sat on my porch in the evening. The sun was setting. The sky was orange and purple. I had a cup of tea. It was hot. It smelled like jasmine. I thought about the $75 million. It was just numbers. It was just security. It was not happiness. Happiness was the quiet. Happiness was the choice. Happiness was knowing I could say no. Happiness was knowing I could walk away. Robert used to say, paperwork matters. He was right. But he was wrong about one thing. It wasn't just the paperwork. It was the backbone. You need both. You need the law. And you need the courage to use it. I looked at the camera. I know you are listening. I know some of you are hurting. I know some of you are afraid. I want to tell you something. You are not a burden. You are not a cost. You are a person. You have value. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Do not let anyone take your dignity. Fight back. Not with anger, with truth, with plans, with paperwork, and with the knowledge that you deserve better. If you are watching this, you are not alone. There are others. There are me. There are many of us. We are still here. We are still standing. So tell me, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Tell me your truth. Sometimes knowing someone else is listening makes all the difference. And if you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe. There are more stories to tell. There is more truth to share. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Good night. Wait, I need to stop. I am getting ahead of myself. That was the ending. I need to write chapters 6 through 10. I need to go back to the house. I need to go back to the investigation. I need to slow down. I need to breathe. I waited until the next morning to make my move. The sun was just coming up over the rooftops. The light was grey and cold. I made coffee in my room. I had a small kettle hidden in the closet. Sarah did not know about it. She thought I drank whatever she gave me. I poured the hot water over the tea bags. I sat by the window. I watched the street. A dog walker passed by. He waved. I waved back. I needed to appear normal. I needed to appear weak. I needed them to think they were winning. I put on my robe. I walked out into the hallway. The house was quiet. I could hear voices coming from the kitchen. It was David and Sarah. They were speaking in low tones. I stopped. I stood behind the corner. I held my breath. The walls in this house were thin. Robert used to complain about the insulation. He said builders did not care anymore. I was glad for that now. I heard Sarah's voice. She was sharp. She said we need to move faster. She said the mother knows something. She said the attorney visit was suspicious. David sighed. I could hear the sound of a spoon stirring coffee. He said she is old. He said she is confused. He said she does not understand the papers. Sarah said she understood enough to lock the door. She said she hid the statement. She said we need the doctor to sign off this week. David said the doctor is booked until next month. Sarah said pay him extra. She said tell him it is an emergency. She said if she gets control of the London money, we lose everything. David said 75 million is a lot of money. Sarah said it is our money. She said we raised her. She said we housed her. She said she owes us. I felt my hands curl into fists. My nails dug into my palms. I stepped back. I walked quietly to my room. I closed the door. I leaned against it. My heart was beating fast. They were not just planning to take the house. They were planning to declare me incompetent. They were planning to buy the doctor. That small glance didn't escape my notice. I spent the rest of the day in my room. I said I was tired. I said my head hurt. Sarah came in at noon with a tray. She had soup and crackers. She looked at me closely. She asked if I needed a pill. I said no. I said I just needed rest. She nodded. She put the tray on the nightstand. She lingered by the door. She said David will be home early. She said he wants to discuss the Ohio deed. I said, okay. I said I will think about it. She left. I waited 10 minutes. I did not eat the soup. I poured it into a plant pot in the corner. I kept the crackers. I needed to keep my strength. I took out my phone. I called the number Margaret gave me. The attorney's direct line. A woman answered. She said her name was Elizabeth. She said she was senior counsel. I told her about the overheard conversation. I told them about the doctor. Elizabeth said this was serious. She said coercion of a witness was a crime. She said bribery of a medical professional was a felony. She said we needed proof. I said I could get it. She said how? I said I had a recorder. Robert bought it years ago. He said it was for meetings. I still had it. It was in my sewing kit. Elizabeth said record everything. She said do not confront them. She said wait for the meeting. She said we will be there. I said okay. I hung up. I hid the phone. I lay down. I closed my eyes. I thought about Robert. I thought about his hands. They were rough from work. They were gentle with me. I missed them. I missed him. But I could not grieve now. I had to fight. I had to protect what was left of my life. I had to protect what was left of my son, even if he did not want to be saved. The next day was Wednesday. David came home at 4 in the afternoon. He was early. He walked into the living room. He was carrying a folder. He sat on the sofa. He patted the spot next to him. He said, "Mom, come sit." He said, "We need to finalize this." I walked over. I sat down. I kept my hands in my lap. He opened the folder. He took out a pen. He said, "Just sign here." He said it transfers the management to me. He said it makes things easier. He said, "You do not have to worry." I looked at the paper. It was the power of attorney. It was updated. It gave him full control. It gave him the right to sell property. It gave him the right to make medical decisions. It gave him the right to spend my money. I picked up the pen. I held it over the paper. David smiled. He relaxed. He thought he had won. Sarah came into the room. She stood behind the sofa. She watched my hand. I hovered the pen over the line. I looked at David. I said, "I have a question." He said, "Yes." He said, "Anything." I said, "Who is the witness?" He said, "What?" I said, "The witness line. It is blank." He said, "I will sign it." I said, "No." I said, "The lawyer said I need an independent witness." He frowned. He said, "What lawyer?" I said, "The one from London." He stiffened. He said, "You are still talking to them?" I said, "Yes." I said, "They want to ensure I am protected." David stood up. He snatched the pen. He said, "You are making this difficult." He said, "You are being selfish." He said, "Do you want to end up in a home?" He said, "Do you want to lose everything?" I looked at him. I said, "I want to keep my mind." I said, "I want to keep my choice." I said, "I will sign when I am ready." David threw the folder on the table. He said, "You are not ready." He said, "You are confused." He said, "Sarah, call the doctor." Sarah pulled out her phone. She said, "He can come tomorrow." I said, "No." I said, "I am not sick." David laughed. It was a cold sound. He said, "We will see about that." He walked out. Sarah followed. I heard them in the kitchen. I heard the fridge open. I heard a bottle pop. They were drinking. They were celebrating. They thought they had me cornered. They thought the doctor would fix everything. But David didn't know one critical detail. I went to my room. I took the recorder out of the sewing kit. It was small, black. It fit in my palm. I tested it. It worked. I put it in my pocket. I walked to the kitchen. I said I was hungry. I said I would eat the soup now. Sarah looked at me. She said, "Good." She said you need to eat. She said you look weak. I sat at the table. I ate the crackers. I listened. David was on the phone in the hallway. He was speaking loudly. He said yes, tomorrow morning. He said 9 o'clock. He said make sure you bring the forms. He said we need to certify decline. He said family history of dementia. He said she forgets things. He said she gets confused. He said yes, we can pay cash. I wrote it all down. I wrote the time. I wrote the name of the doctor. I wrote the amount. $5,000. I finished the crackers. I stood up. I said, thank you for the food. I walked back to my room. I locked the door. I sent the audio file to Elizabeth. I sent the notes. I waited. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Elizabeth. It said, we have enough. It said, stay in the house. It said, do not leave. It said, tomorrow we end this. I put the phone away. I looked out the window. The sun was setting. The shadows were long. I thought about the $75 million. I thought about the $200 card. I thought about the son who wanted to sell me. I was not afraid anymore. I was ready. I lay on the bed. I closed my eyes. I slept better than I had in months. I dreamed of Robert. He was standing on the porch. He was holding a hammer. He was fixing the stairs. He looked at me. He said, you did good, Joan. He said, you did good. I woke up at 6 o'clock. The house was silent. I got dressed. I put on my best suit. It was blue. It was the one I wore to Robert's funeral. I put on my pearls. I looked in the mirror. I looked like myself. I walked out of the room. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I waited. At 8:30, a car pulled up. It was not the doctor. It was a black sedan. 2 people got out, a man and a woman. They wore badges. They walked to the door. They knocked. David opened the door. He looked confused. He said, can I help you? The man said, we are from the state. He said, we are here for an welfare check. David said, for who? The man said, for Joan Miller. He looked past David. He looked at me. He said, are you Joan? I said, yes. He said, we received a report of coercion. He said, we need to speak with you. David stepped in front of me. He said, she is sick. He said, she cannot speak. The woman stepped forward. She said, sir, step aside. She said, or we will call the police. David looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at me. I took a sip of my coffee. I set the cup down. I said, please come in. I said, I have much to show you. David turned pale. He said, Mom, what are you doing? I said, I am saving you. I said, from yourself. The officers walked in. They opened their notebooks. David backed away. He hit the wall. He said this is a mistake. I said no, David. I said this is justice. And then the doorbell rang again. It was the doctor. He was early. He looked at the officers. He looked at me. He froze. He said I was not told there would be police. I said neither was I. But I am glad you are here. I said we have much to discuss. The cliffhanger was not the money. It was not the house. It was the look on David's face. He knew he was caught. He knew it was over. But he did not know what I would do next. Would I send him to jail? Would I cut him off? Would I forgive? I looked at him. I did not smile. I did not frown. I just waited. The clock on the wall ticked. 9 o'clock. The time they planned to bury me. Instead, it was the time I woke up. The doctor shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked at David. He looked at the state officials. He looked at me. His hands were shaking. He held a black bag that contained the forms they planned to use to declare me incompetent. The man from the States stepped forward. He asked the doctor for his identification. The doctor fumbled in his pocket. He pulled out a wallet. He handed over a card. The official looked at it. He looked at the doctor. He said, "We will need to speak with you separately." The doctor nodded. He did not speak. He walked to the corner of the room. He stared at the floor. David stepped toward me. His face was red. He said, "Mom, what have you done?" He said, "You called them on me." He said, "I am your son." I looked at him. I said, "I called them to protect me. I said you were going to sell me. I said you were going to lock me away." David shook his head. He said, "That is not true. He said we were trying to help. He said you are not well." The official turned to David. He said, "Sir, please step back." He said, "Do not interfere." David ignored him. He looked at me. He said, "You are making a mistake." He said, "You will regret this." He said, "When you need help, no one will come." I felt a calmness settle over me. It was like the quiet after a storm. I said, "I will not need help from you." I said, "I have made other arrangements." Sarah spoke for the first time. She was standing by the refrigerator. She said, "What arrangements?" She said, "You have no money." She said, "The card is all you have." I smiled. It was a small smile. I said, "The card is in the trash." I said, "I do not need it." The official wrote something in his notebook. He asked me if I felt safe in this house. I said no. I said, "I have not felt safe for months." I said, "I have recordings." I said, "I have documents." I said, "I have witnesses." The official looked up. He said, "We will need to see those." I said, "They are ready." I walked to my room. I did not ask for permission. I did not look back. I heard David shouting behind me. He was telling the official that I was confused. He was telling them I had dementia. He was telling them I was lying. I closed my door. I locked it. I sat on the bed. I took out the recorder. I took out the folder from the London attorney. I took out the bank statements I had retrieved. I put them in a pile. I looked at the clock. It was 9:15. The investigation was over. The judgment was beginning. I stood up. I opened the door. I walked back into the living room. The room was silent. David was sitting on the sofa. His head was in his hands. Sarah was standing by the window. She was looking out at the street. The doctor was still in the corner. The official stood up. He said, "Mrs. Miller, are you ready?" I said, "Yes." I handed him the folder. He opened it. He looked at the pages. His eyebrows went up. He looked at me. He said, "This is substantial." He said, "This is evidence of fraud." He said, "This is evidence of coercion." I said, "I know." I said, "I want it." On the record. He nodded. He said it will be. He turned to David. He said, "Sir, you need to come with us." He said there are questions to answer. David stood up. He looked at me. His eyes were full of anger. He said, "You are destroying this family." He said, "You are choosing money over us." I felt a pain in my chest. It was sharp. It was real. I said, "I am choosing myself." I said, "You destroyed this family when you decided I was a burden." I said, "You destroyed this family when you planned to steal my life." David laughed. It was a harsh sound. He said, "Steal?" He said, "We took care of you." He said, "We fed you." He said, "We housed you." I said, "You charged me for it." I said, "You gave me an allowance." I said, "You treated me like a child." I said, "You treated me like a prisoner." The official stepped between us. He said, "That is enough." He said, "Sir, please come with me." David did not move. He looked at Sarah. He said, "Do something." Sarah shook her head. She said, "I did not know about the doctor." She said, "I thought it was legal." She said David said it was standard. David looked at her. He said, "You agreed." He said you signed the forms. Sarah stepped back. She said I was following your lead. She said you said she was losing her mind. The room felt heavy. The air was thick with betrayal. I watched them turn on each other. It was like watching a building collapse. Slow, inevitable. Dust everywhere. I walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I drank it. I watched the officials escort David to the door. He stopped at the threshold. He turned to me. He said, "You will be alone." He said, "No one will want you." He said, "You are just an old woman." I put the glass down. I said, "I am not just an old woman." I said, "I am Joan." I said, "I am free." He walked out. The door closed. The sound was final, like a book shutting. I stood in the hallway. I listened to the car start. I listened to it drive away. The house was quiet. The doctor walked past me. He did not look at me. He said, "I'm sorry." He said I needed the money. He said my practice was failing. I said, "I know." I said, "We all struggle." I said, "But you chose wrong." He nodded. He left. The official stayed. He said, "We will be in touch." He said, "You are safe now." He said, "Do not stay here alone tonight." I said, "I will not." I said, "I have a place to go." He nodded. He left. I locked the door. I leaned against it. I slid down to the floor. I put my head in my hands. I did not cry. I was too tired for tears. I was too relieved for tears. I sat there for an hour. The sun moved across the floor. The dust motes danced in the light. I stood up. I went to my room. I packed my bag. I took only what was mine. I left the rest. I walked out the front door. I did not look back. The car was waiting. It was not a taxi. It was the car from the London firm. The driver opened the door. He said, "Mrs. Miller?" He said, "We have a reservation." I said, "Where?" He said, "The hotel." He said, "Then the new house." I said, "Okay." I got in. We drove away. I watched the house in the rearview mirror. It got smaller. It disappeared. I was leaving it all behind. The son, the daughter-in-law, the lies, the fear. I was going to a place where I was known, where I was valued, where I was Joan. That small unanswered question is where the truth begins. I stayed at the hotel for 3 nights. It was a quiet place, near the park. The staff treated me with respect. They asked how I liked my coffee. They asked if I needed extra pillows. They did not check my mail. They did not count my food. I slept for 12 hours the first night. I did not dream. I just rested. On the 4th day, the attorney called. He said the new house was ready. He said it was in Cleveland. He said it was near the school where I taught. I said that sounds perfect. I packed my bag. I got in the car. We drove for 2 hours. The trees changed from city to suburb. The roads became quieter. We turned onto Maple Street. The house was brick, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small garden. It was not big, it was not luxurious. It was mine. The attorney handed me the keys. He said the deed is in your name. He said no one else has access. He said the funds are secure. I took the keys. They were heavy. They felt like freedom. I walked inside. The floors were wood. The walls were white. It smelled like fresh paint. I put my bag down. I walked to the kitchen. I opened the cupboard. It was empty. I opened the fridge. It was empty. I smiled. I would fill it myself. I would choose the food. I would choose the time. I walked to the living room. There was a fireplace. I imagined Robert sitting there. Imagined him reading the paper. I imagined him smiling at me. I sat on the floor. I cried then, just for a moment. It was for him. It was for the years we lost. It was for the son I lost. I wiped my eyes. I stood up. I went to the store. I bought groceries. I bought flowers. I bought a rug. I put them in the house. I made it mine. The phone started ringing the next day. It was David. He was out on bail. He said, "Mum, please." He said, "Come home." He said, "We made a mistake." I said, "No." I said, "You did not make a mistake. I said you made a choice." He said, "We can fix it." He said, "We need you." I said, "You need my money." He said, "That is not true." I said, "It is exactly true." I said, "Do not call me again." I hung up. He called back. I did not answer. He sent letters. I returned them. He sent his lawyer. My lawyer sent a letter back. It said, "Cease and desist." It said, "Stay away." It said, "Contact will result in charges." He stopped calling. I heard through a neighbor that they lost the house. I heard they moved to an apartment. I heard they were selling furniture. I did not feel happy. I did not feel sad. I felt nothing. It was their path. I was on mine. I started volunteering at the library. I helped children read. I saw a boy once. He looked like David. He struggled with a word. I helped him. He smiled. He said thank you. I said, "You are welcome." I realized I still had love to give, just not to those who took it for granted. I gave it to those who asked kindly. I gave it to those who respected me. I joined a book club. I went to coffee with friends. I travelled to London. I met Margaret. We walked in the park. We talked about Elizabeth. We talked about Robert. We talked about the future. I was not afraid anymore. I was not lonely. I was alone, but I was not lonely. There is a difference. Loneliness is a lack of connection. Being alone is a state of being. I was connected to myself. I was connected to my truth. I was connected to my life. 1 year later. I got a letter. It was from David. It was handwritten. The paper was cheap. The handwriting was shaky. He said he was sorry. He said he missed me. He said he understood now. He said he hoped I was well. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for help. He just said, sorry. I read the letter. I held it for a long time. I thought about burning it. I thought about keeping it. I put it in a drawer. I closed the drawer. I did not write back. Not yet. Maybe someday, when the pain was less, when the memory was softer. For now, I was content. I sat on my porch in the evening. The sun was setting. The sky was orange and purple. I had a cup of tea. It was hot. It smelled like jasmine. I thought about the $75 million. It was just numbers. It was just security. It was not happiness. Happiness was the quiet. Happiness was the choice. Happiness was knowing I could say no. Happiness was knowing I could walk away. Robert used to say paperwork matters. He was right. But he was wrong about one thing. It wasn't just the paperwork. It was the backbone. You need both. You need the law, and you need the courage to use it. And suddenly the conversation from last night made terrible sense. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. The house on Maple Street became a home. I planted flowers in the garden. I hung pictures on the walls. I bought a new chair. It was comfortable. It was not Robert's chair. It was mine. I invited Margaret to stay. She came for a month. We cooked together. We walked together. We talked about everything. She asked me if I regretted it. She asked if I regretted cutting David off. I thought about it. I said I regret that it happened. I said I do not regret stopping it. I said I had to save myself. I said if I did not, who would? She nodded. She said you did the right thing. She said it is hard. She said, but it is right. I agreed. It was hard. There were nights I cried. There were days I wondered if I was too harsh. But then I remembered the card. I remembered the $200. I remembered the look in David's eyes when he thought he had won. I remembered the doctors shaking hands. I remembered the plan to lock me away. I knew I was right. I knew I was safe. I knew I was free. I started writing. I wrote down my story. I wrote down the details. I wrote down the numbers. I wrote down the names. I wanted to remember. I wanted others to know. I wanted them to know they are not alone. I wanted them to know they have power. I wanted them to know they have worth. I sent the story to a friend. She said you should share it. She said it will help people. I said I do not know. She said, trust me. I trusted her. I recorded the audio. I sat in my living room. I spoke into the microphone. I told the truth. I did not hide anything. I did not soften the blows. I told it exactly as it happened. I finished the recording. I listened to it. It sounded like me. It sounded like Joan. I sent it out. I waited. The response was immediate. People wrote to me. They said thank you. They said I am going through the same thing. They said you gave me courage. They said I am going to fight. I read the messages. I cried. I was happy. I was helping. I was doing good. I was using my pain for purpose. I was using my story for strength. I was not just a victim. I was a survivor. I was a warrior. I was a mother. I was a woman. I was Joan. The money was still there. It was still in the account. I used some of it. I fixed the roof. I bought a car. I donated to the school. I donated to the library. I helped families. I helped seniors. I helped those who had no voice. I became their voice. I became their support. I became their hope. I looked at the camera. I know you were listening. I know some of you are hurting. I know some of you are afraid. I want to tell you something. You are not a burden. You are not a cost. You are a person. You have value. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Do not let anyone take your dignity. Fight back. Not with anger, with truth, with plans, with paperwork, and with the knowledge that you deserve better. If you are watching this, you are not alone. There are others. There are me. There are many of us. We are still here. We are still standing. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Like the video and subscribe. There is more truth to share. There are more stories to tell. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Good night. I sat on the porch. The sun was gone. The stars were out. I looked up. I found the brightest one. I thought it was Robert. I thought he was watching. I thought he was proud. I whispered to the sky. I said, I did it. Robert. I said I kept the promise. I said I kept the dignity. I said I kept the love. The wind blew through the trees. It sounded like a voice. It sounded like laughter. It sounded like home. I went inside. I locked the door. I turned off the lights. I went to bed. I slept peacefully. I dreamed of the future. It was bright. It was clear. It was mine. I woke up the next morning. The sun was shining. The birds were singing. I made coffee. I sat at the table. I looked at the calendar. There were no appointments. There were no obligations. There was just life. I picked up the pen. I wrote down the date. I wrote down the time. I wrote down my name. Joan. Just Joan. No one else's mother. No one else's burden. Just me. I smiled. I took a sip of coffee. It was perfect. I looked at the wall. There was a frame there. It had a quote inside. It was Robert's handwriting. It said, "Paperwork matters." I laughed. I said, "Yes, Robert." I said it does. But so do I. I stood up. I washed the cup. I put it away. I walked to the door. I opened it. I stepped outside. The air was fresh. The day was new. I walked down the street. I waved to the neighbours. They waved back. I went to the park. I sat on a bench. I watched the children play. I watched the dogs run. I watched the world turn. I was part of it. I was not hidden. I was not ashamed. I was visible. I was valuable. I was alive. I closed my eyes. I listened to the sounds. The traffic, the birds, the wind, the life. I opened my eyes. I looked at my hands. They were old. They were wrinkled. They were strong. I clenched them into fists. I relaxed them. I was ready for whatever came next. I was ready for the future. I was ready for me. The phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Margaret. She said, "Are you coming to London?" She said, "We miss you." I typed back. I said, "Yes." I said, "I will be there soon." I said, "I have things to do first." I said, "I have a life to live." I put the phone away. I stood up. I walked home. The house was waiting. The door was open. The light was on. I walked in. I closed the door. I was home. I was safe. I was free. And that is the only thing that matters. Not the money, not the house, not the sun. Just the freedom, just the peace, just the self. I sat in my chair. I picked up a book. I opened it. I started to read. The words were clear. The story was good. The ending was mine. I turned the page. I kept reading. I kept living. I kept being Joan. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The clock on the wall ticked. It was not a hammer anymore. It was a heartbeat. It was a rhythm. It was a song. I listened to it. I smiled. I turned the page. I read on. The sun set. The moon rose. The night came. I was still here. I was still reading. I was still living. I was still Joan. And I always would be. No matter what. No matter where. No matter when. I am Joan. I am free. I am me. And that is the end of the story. Or maybe it is the beginning. Either way, it is mine. Thank you. Good night. God bless.